online seminar of the Standing Group of the European Union Group of the CPR of this academic year. It's Jonathan's and I pleasure as co-chair to have a presentation today entitled Challenges to Euro-Mediterranean Cooperation, Regulating Mobility via Mobility Partnership. Our speaker today is Stefania Panebianco, is Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Catania and holder of the Jean Monnet Chair EU Media. And she has recently joined us in the steering committee after her election earlier this year. So Stefania, you will have 30 to 40 minutes for your presentation. And then we have the pleasure to listen to Michel Pace. I'm sorry for that. I don't know if I have to pronounce it as an Italian name or a Nordic name. He's professor in global studies at Roskilde University in Denmark and associate fellow at Chatham House in the UK. So thank you very much to both of you, and thank you again for the patience of the audience. So Stefania, you have the floor for 30 to 40 minutes.
Thank you very much, Natalie, and thank you to all of you for being so patient, for having coped with this technological unforeseen issue. Before I start, let me say how honored I am to have this opportunity this afternoon to share this presentation at the Standing Group on the European Union online seminar series. I'm really very pleased to have this opportunity, and of course I'm very pleased and honored to serve in the steering committee of the Standing Group of the European Union of the ECPR. I'm grateful to Michel Pace, who's going to comment on a paper that I have circulated beforehand, and this is extremely useful for us in our community to have feedback, and even considering that our time has become a precious resource. So thank you very much, Michel. As you can see from the title of this presentation is trying to combine different branches of literature, and the main broader dimension and field of research is challenges to Euro-Mediterranean cooperation. Euro-Mediterranean relations is actually my main field of research and teaching, and the subtitle refers to a different and more specific dimension of not generally the European Union as international actor, but more specifically the external dimension of migration and asylum policy. As you have in the meantime probably imagined, this is a co-joined research, an ongoing research that I share with Giuseppe Cannata, that you have already met online. And this research is framed within a research program funded by the Erasmus Plus program of the European Union that is called MORDOR. As the logo indicates, it seeks to map and organize research on dictatorships, and would also include authoritarian regimes, weak democratic regimes, and so on and so forth. This research is coordinated by Jérôme van den Bosch at Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznan, and luckily at the University of Catania, principal investigator is my colleague Daniela Herrera. Which is the aim of this research? Of course, we try to engage in existing literature, and our objective within this project, and also within this specific research, our objective is to foster what has already been said, to engage with existing literature, and first of all, as the research and the title suggests, we deal with the democratization literature. Well, it is a state of fact that although the enthusiasm of the 90s, we know that in the 90s, studies on international dimensions of democratization have been flourishing. This is extremely, well, this is rather well known. It was very fascinating because at that time we were all arguing to what extent the international dimension can provide a sort of a frame for democratization, then can international actors be drivers to democracy? Well, of course, this is a literature that reminds us, for example, Lawrence Whitehead with his international dimensions of democratization. But of course, there is a difference between what, for example, the European Union can do within the framework of enlargement, that is anchoring applicant countries to a framework, which is the EU framework. We can discuss today whether this framework is still democratic today or not, and to what extent we have a problem, an inherent domestic problem with the democratization. But at that time, this kind of literature was extremely popular. But over time, we have realized that one thing, again, is to anchor countries to democratization processes. Another thing is to facilitate these processes. And in any case, we have acquired as a state of fact that if there are local actors, and when I think about local actors, I have in mind political elites, civil society, but also administrations that do not share this democratization process, well, there is a problem. Then what is important is that there is a combination of top-down and bottom-up processes. And when these two different processes match, democratization processes can flourish and can take place. This does not mean automatic consolidation. You know, democratization is never a linear process, but at least this is a good framework. Which is the aim of this specific research? How do we want, with Giuseppe, foster what has already been said? Well, actually, the main aim of this research is to explore a nexus. Well, nexus is a very popular in our field. In new politics, nexus is definitely a very popular concept, and investigating various nexuses is relevant, but, oh, well, it intrigues our academic curiosity. But dealing with mobility, democracy nexus has so far not really very unexplored field of study. And it is, in fact, in the European Commission's discourse, and what we have conducted is qualitative research analysis, a qualitative content analysis, dealing not only, of course, on formal communications. What I have in mind, considering the topic that we are dealing with, is first of all the communication of the European Commission of 2011, a new response to a changing neighborhood, and also the communication of the European Commission, a partnership for democracy and shared prosperity. This is the, let's say, beginning of this kind of new elan that was emerging in the aftermath of the Arab uprisings. And again, we believe that there is a sort of lack in the existing research, and we try to move a bit further rather than this conceptualization of a nexus that is provided by the European Commission, so to see to what extent we can identify in practice policy tools that provide, that allow for this nexus to be implemented. And we would like to know what has happened. We are investigating what has happened in practice in this last decade. Well, we are aware that the European Union has in a way tried to relaunch, profiting of this kind of new elan after the Arab uprisings, to relaunch Euro-Mediterranean relations, identifying these three instruments: more market, more money, more mobility, that were the framed within this slogan of the new approach, the new 3Ms approach of the European Union. Well, what does not work with this new brackets approach is that there are problems in providing conditional support, and these problems the European Union is facing are inherent in the tools that the European Union is trying to adopt, and it is the mobility partnership as an instrument, as a tool for leveraging democratization processes that is suffering. It is suffering for various reasons. Okay, we always say that the European Union as an international actor is very weak. We are always saying that the European Union is very inconsistent, so on and so forth. We have been talking in these last 20 years about the issues related to the European Union as a normative power. Europe, well, we would like, of course, to explore different and new branches of research looking at this instrument of the mobility partnerships in order to see exactly what is not working with this mobility partnership, combining the EU on the one hand and the partners, because our assumption, our idea is that the partners have a role. Well, we are exactly exploring this contribution, the function of southern neighborhood countries, considering their agency, considering their role within the negotiations, considering their function when there are negotiations that say dealing regarding mobility partnerships. Then the research design develops three main research questions. The first question is how this nexus between mobility and democracy promotion has unfolded in the context of the use of 3M's approach in the southern neighborhood. Then we try to investigate how mobility partnerships, how can mobility partnerships with southern neighborhood countries impact on democracy promotion. And our answer, of course, is that this is not an effective policy tool. And the part of the research that is currently going on develops exactly this function of the agency of the authoritarian, these authoritarian regimes. So far, looking at the documents we have elaborated as a statement, well, we have provided an answer to the third research question: are authoritarian regimes and elites in partner countries able to influence the effectiveness of the youth mobility democracy nexus? We are convinced that these authoritarian regimes are have in a way being strengthened over time. The focus is on three specific cases, three countries, and you might imagine quite easily why we have selected Morocco, Tunisia, and Jordan, because actually these are the only three countries that have signed, that have engaged in mobility partnership negotiations. In 2013 with Morocco, in 2014 with Tunisia and Jordan, but we also believe that it is relevant to see these three countries as strategic countries, considering the routes, the migration routes in the Mediterranean. We, a contrario, are also looking at the reasons why with Egypt and Lebanon this process has been more difficult, because also these two cases, in our opinion, might provide useful insights. The hypothesis. After the Arab uprisings, the new EU democracy promotion strategy, based upon the interconnection of mobility market and money, has not been transformed into effective policy tools. Second hypothesis, the use offer for more mobility through the Mediterranean partnerships does not represent a credible incentive. We believe that this is the issue, the key issue is that the European Union has not been able to leverage change, political change in the countries. Hypothesis 3, cooperation through mobility partnerships has contributed to the legitimization of southern neighborhood countries, authoritarian elites as negotiating partners vis-a-vis the EU actors. Markets. Very, very briefly, I know that already 50 minutes have passed. What can we say about the 3 M's very, very quickly, and then we will move to mobility more in details. Okay, markets is a very, I would say, a traditional pillar of EU democracy promotion. Okay, the European Union has traditionally tried, probably because of the history, the experience that the European Union had concerning its European integration process. Liberalization, market access is a traditional pillar of EU democracy. But indeed, it's what the European Union has tried to do in the aftermath of the Arab risings. But then these tool has not been, I would say, appreciated by the partners. As a matter of fact, negotiating mandates for these deep, comprehensive free trade agreements, the European Union was insisting a lot at that time on this deep cooperation, as if there were no cooperation before. Now everything was deeper, more engaging, etc. Well, actually, free trade areas are suffering, and therefore these have zoomed and highlighted the fact that probably it is unappealing what the European Union is offering in terms of trade liberalization. This has zoomed and highlighted the existing economic and trade asymmetries, and this is the reason why there is this the sufferance of the DCFTA. Yes. Money. Well, money is not a bone of contentious. Money has always been the tradition again of the Euro-Mediterranean relations. If we look at the fundings, these fundings towards towards southern neighborhood countries has been increasing over time, well, more or less consistently, apart from a drop in 2018 concerning Morocco, but more or less consistently fundings has been there, has been increasing. And even if we look at specific examples of cooperation, and if we look at the EU TF and MADAD, and these are specific fundings devoted to address, in the first case, the causes of migration in Africa, and in the second case, after 2015, the European Union has tried to help countries, southern countries, to deal with the issue of the Syrian crisis. Then this is not, again, the issue of contentious. What is more critically, more critical, I would say, is definitely mobility partnerships. Well, we know that mobility partnerships were not originally adopted to deal with southern neighborhood countries. In 2007, these instruments were devoted to Moldova and Capo Verde, and we know that it is since 2011 that mobility partnerships were, we can say, repositioned at the crossroad between the global approach to migration and this new approach to new, in brackets again, to democracy promotion. Well, what has not worked and what is not delivering concerning this mobility democracy nexus is the fact that inherently mobility partnerships try to combine two different dimensions. On the one hand, the dimension of the promotion, the facilitation of regular migration, and this is the most critical issue, and on the other hand, the fight to irregular migration. Then it is this facilitation of regular migration through the mobility partnerships as a positive incentive for leverage that has not worked. And the idea that mobility as a tool to enhance democratic governance in the form of more transparent, legitimacy-based and inclusive migration policies in the southern neighborhood countries is not providing its, well, the wished goals. Why is it so? Over time, in particular after 2015, the dimension of the security side, the need to defend the borders, I'm not saying closing the borders, but definitely defend the borders, has overwhelmed and had an impact on the facilitation of the promotion of regular migration. Figure 3, for example, is identifying, is projecting the rejection of short-term uniform visa applications. And in all three countries, in all three cases, Morocco, Tunisia, and Jordan, this rate has, from 2013 to last year, has been increasing. And this is, in our opinion, extremely interesting, because instead of having a wider regular migration, more selective issuance of visas, in particular short-term visas, has been adopted. And it also, this slide and this figure is not shown, but also if we look at the first permits issued in 2008, 2020 by citizenship, we see that the figures are dropping, considering again Morocco, Tunisia, and Jordan, or are stably very, very low, as in the case of Tunisia and Jordan. Then this policy tool is not delivering what was considered. And even if we look at the EU, this is the other dimension, the fight to irregular migration. If we look at the mobility partnerships as comprehensive framework for cooperation on specific issues, and we might consider the visa facilitation agreements, we could consider also the EU emergency, the EU readmission agreements. These tools are in a standstill. Then this means that there is less effective cooperation on readmissions. And then not even on the dimension of fighting irregular migration, these tools are delivering what was originally envisaged or promised. And if we look at this widening gap between orders to leave and completed returns, in a while we will have some figures, this instrument clearly reveals to be ineffective. The last point that I will show in a second with the categories. This is an example that is taken from the mobility partnership with Morocco and the instrument of migration partnership facility with Morocco. We see that the traditional categories are still prioritized by partnership facilities. We see law enforcement public officials, we see much less students and youth, we see much less seasonal workers. Then there are ineffective tools. This is, I am going a bit quickly because I know that Michel Patch has to leave in a while, then I don't want to abuse of my time considering the short delay at the beginning. EURA and visa facilitation agreements are suffering. Orders to leave and effective returns do not match. How to conclude and what can we say to conclude? Well, the optimism of 10 years ago has in a way vanished. And if we look at the different not just rhetoric via the content analysis, but really what is identified as an objective in the EU documents is a sort of vanishing of democracy promotion and an emergence of democratization via good governance. This is clear from another document which has been released in 2020, the new agenda for the Mediterranean. There is a clear focus on security, migration and development that are part of a sort of comprehensive dimension, and there is no reference, no direct reference to democracy support. The good governance is identified as a goal. Then the nexus that the European Commission had constructed and had conceptualized, anchoring it within this more approach is not working. It's clear that if more mobility is traded at the same time for more cooperation on combating irregular migration and promoting more democracy, unfortunately, okay, I should not say unfortunately, but in fact, prioritizing the former has been the result. Migration and mobility, rather than a tool to leverage democratic change, seems to hamper the EU's capacity to reinforce and support democratization processes in partner countries. What we are seeing, what is emerging from the analysis is that, can we say again, the stability democratization dilemma is still in the documents, and the European Union remains entrapped within the traditional stability priority that has frozen the outcome that was initially foreseen, and therefore this pro-democratic, well, the fostering of democratic change is suffering. Well, then again, we started from the statement that it is not always, well, it is not possible to identify democratization, political change and democratic reforms as a direct consequence, as the result of EU external support. Well, we are perfectly aware of that, and this is another case that shows that it is not possible to identify specific impact of single factors, but it is also true that the European Union is not providing credible incentives. And still, the asymmetries between EU commitments and their implementation does prove that this EU more for more strategy cannot deliver, and it remains ineffective. Then, democracy nexus, mobility democracy nexus. We see that authoritarian elites have been remaining in power and probably have been even empowered by the negotiation and the partial implementation of mobility partnerships. Then this nexus is challenged and has been challenged also, not just and not only because of EU different interests and these overwhelming external dimension of migration and asylum policy that tends to externalize to third actors control of the EU borders, but also because of the function and requests or the advocacy, the role, the agency of the partners in the negotiation. Thank you so much. I know that Professor Patch has comments. Of course, Giuseppe is anytime invited to intervene if he wishes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stefania, also for sticking to the time. And now I give the floor to Michelle for comments and feedbacks. And after that, we will open up the floor. You will just have to raise your hands or post a comment on the chat to ask your question.
Okay, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thanks. So thank you, Stefania, and thank you, Giuseppe, for giving me this opportunity to also really dig deep into your research, which I have been following for some time, Stefania. And perhaps one of the things that I'm going to push you to do is to actually bring some deeper insights that I managed to pull out from your research, which I feel are not granted enough exposure in your paper as it is currently written. So perhaps I am going to build up more on your conclusions, Stefania, which you presented now, which perhaps have not been so clear in your written paper that you sent me. But one of the things that really emerges to me is what the EU says in terms of rhetoric, what the EU intends, and what it actually does. So I made a big note here about EU rhetoric, intention, and action. And I see no other area that can expose the EU so much as this particular area you have chosen. So I think, just to sum up for those who haven't had the privilege to read the paper, you take us straight to this challenge of what you refer to as the EU mobility democracy nexus. And then you talk about mobility, immobility, and political, in particular, immobilism in the southern neighborhood. And you argue that since the Arab uprisings in particular, the EU has reframed its relations with its neighbors to the south through various documents, but in particular, this communication on a partnership for democracy and shared prosperity from 2011. Now, you also tell us that the EU promised more money, mobility, and markets, the so-called 3Ms, in exchange for more political reform in the MENA. And you argue that in this way, the EU-South neighbors' relations were framed within this kind of mobility democracy nexus. But you also acknowledge that over these 10 years or so, we have more entrenched authoritarianisms, as in particular Al-Sisi's Egypt, but also immobilism, because the mobilism that we do have is, as you mentioned, extremely selective and very short term. So my comments are really to push you, as I said, to perhaps start with making clear what exactly do these mobility partnerships promise. You do acknowledge that they are an instrument, but actually they are quite a smart instrument for the EU's externalization of migration control. So here I think, again, I would push you to really say something about your research unpacking what the EU says by way of rhetoric and what the EU actually does in practice. And in between this, there is some kind of declared intention, right? So I am curious, whose reading is this about this mobility democracy nexus? Is this because you kind of use the language of to some extent? And I'm curious, is this your reading of this nexus, or is this something that you've gathered from interviews with EU officials? Because I actually read this more as a mobility development nexus rather than a mobility democracy nexus. And for example, you say the recent migration crisis has to some extent attracted the attention on a linkage between the literature on democracy promotion and local agency. So I think this linkage that you talk about, I would want to have more meat to the bone, where you get this from and whether this is yours or whether, this is a claim that European officials make or documents, that very clearly identify this nexus, because I didn't see enough references. So this was kind of a more general point. Now, I think that you empirically provide us with a very rich and corroborated, piece of work that clearly shows a commendable amount of research. And I do appreciate your efforts, but I think you have enough material to take both the academic discussion, but even more so the policy making community a little bit into really the reflection zone. And I'm thinking particularly here about the recent statement made by Borrell on the 13th of October, to be precise, where he's still talking in this neo-colonial terms of we are, the garden, and out there it's the jungle. So I'm thinking here that it's very important to give this introduction and analysis of mobility partnerships and the specific cases that you choose. But I also think that you don't necessarily help yourself with trying to have 3 research questions and 3 hypotheses for one paper. I think you have a much bigger agenda. And I know this is part of a project, and that's why I'm daring to say what I'm about to say, because I think the manner in which you try to cram all this in ends up quite confusing for those who are trying to really delineate what is precisely the research puzzle in this particular paper. So I'm going to give you some food for thought. Sorry? Okay. So for instance, one missing reflection is the question, how and with what purpose are different aspects of EU external policy, whether they are migration, whether they are security, whether they are development, whether they are labor market, whether they are economic issues, how are these linked to mobility partnerships? So as I said, I really have a hard time to read how democracy promotion fits into all these aspects of money, markets, and mobility. And I am not convinced, actually, that democracy promotion was on the EU's mind when they devised mobility partnerships specifically for their relations with the South. They might have said that by way of rhetoric, but I don't think they were actually convinced that this is really what they are after. And I say this because from my own research, I can share with all of you that since the Arab uprisings, what we actually have had in Brussels is a kind of rethink within the EU's power corridors of the whole democracy promotion infrastructure and mechanisms that they had. Because if there was one thing that the Arab uprisings have shown, is that change does not come from without, but it comes from within. So actually what I observe is that there was a period of silence for some time when the EU understood that its intervention, by way of at least rhetorically talking about promoting democracy, was actually unwelcome by those who risked their life to go and protest in the squares of major cities and other areas in the MENA region. So I think one of the things that we need to clarify here is that EU documentation shows us that after this reflection period, the EU stops talking about democracy promotion and they start talking about democracy support, which means that they actually acknowledge that their intervention is only going to happen when it is asked for by the people who really want change. So this was just something that I observed from my own research. Now, when the EU does its own migration and asylum policy, I think one of the questions that your research can answer is how what the EU does in the area of migration and asylum actually impacts what it says or it seeks to do on democracy support. I think that makes for a much more interesting question. So what the EU does in one policy area, what are the ramifications of that on democracy support? So if, for instance, we are exporting arms to these countries, what does that say about us using leverage or conditionality to then ask for respect for human rights? That throws up a lot of questions about the EU's non-normative powers, particularly in the MENA region. So I say this because it is a well-known fact that the EU and its member states have themselves been violating international norms when it comes to externalization policies on migration and asylum. And I don't have to mention here what has been done in terms of pushbacks and the whole, the whole scenario with Frontex and the director having to resign, etc. So I think these are important matters to bring, but also to think about from the point of view of MENA partners, that they actually have a market now through which they can call on the Chinese or the Russians to invest in the MENA region and not having that conditionality or request for political transformation. So the EU's leverage is also shrinking because it has real competitors on the international arena. And these are not necessarily, the bastions of liberal democracy. So although, of course, states have the right to decide whether to grant non-EU nationals access to their territory, we know that they must do this in accordance with the law, and they have to uphold individuals' fundamental rights. So what I'm saying is that if EU practices in the area of migration and asylum are not upholding the very norms that its member states and the EU itself is party to, then we cannot expect our partners to not have even more leverage on the EU to say, basically, if you don't respect international norms, how can you then tell us to respect these norms? So this whole rhetoric of democracy support is extremely, diluted by the EU's own violation of those very norms. So I think another question that I would find interesting for this research to tackle is precisely to zoom in on which interests and which actors underlie these mobility partners. and these mobility partnerships. So, you yourself point out in the paper how the EU concerns about migration management condition and constrain its democratization agenda. So, clearly the core interest of the EU with these mobility partnerships is to pass the buck to southern neighbors who are then held responsible of, keeping people back from seeking safety in European areas. So, and we know the drill, right? The EU uses the carrot of money. So we shouldn't be surprised when the Turks or others use then their leverage to threaten Europe to say, fine, we will flood Europe with migrants if you don't send more money. So, I think the point you can make really cohesively with your research is that the EU is becoming even more complicit in entrenching authoritarianism and in the violation of the rights of the people who seek safety. So this is quite serious, and I think you have the material to prove this. So relatedly, these rhetorical comments about enhanced conditions for legal movements, such as the visa facilitation agreements, you yourself have shown us in your presentation, Stefania, that these have not really materialized in practice. So, what is the point of making commitments when we have a very selective group of people in mind that don't really enhance the situation of further economic development and the expansion of markets for these southern neighbors? So I think this idea of the perception of democracy, who is reading this and how it's accompanying mobility partnership policy instruments, is to my mind a stretch of the imagination, because I don't see the EU interested in this whatsoever, or if it is really making mockery of its own rhetoric in this issue. And Stefania, that even from the Barcelona Declaration of 1995, the logic was always, if we support economic development, then automatically political reform will follow. And the Arab uprisings have proved this amply, that this was a very flawed assumption. So I think we have to move on from that. So I have been trying to find ways in which you can really make a contribution. And I think one of the things that for me was fascinating is this idea of strategic interaction. So I would push you in that direction to tell us what you mean by this strategic interaction, which seemingly in the paper remains undefined. So how, has the EU's relations with the southern neighborhood, isn't this always the case that the EU has been strategic in its interaction with the southern neighborhoods? And if this is not a surprise, maybe you can point us to how we can develop this notion at a deeper level. So the EU strategizing on every move it makes in regard to the MENA is as old as politics itself, and various studies have demonstrated the pervasiveness of interests over values. So I think what is more interesting is to try and find out why gaps persist between the EU's rhetoric and its actions. One of the things that I find very interesting when I conduct interviews in Brussels is the frustration of individual policymakers that don't replicate themselves at the institutional level. So I think to pose one why question will refocus your paper on the more analytical value of this research rather than the descriptive level, and to emphasize, where we can identify these gaps between EU rhetoric and action, and what can help us explain. Now, there is a related notion here of agency. You talk a lot about the agency and the leverage of actors in the southern neighborhoods. And of course, this depends on which agents we're talking about. I think if we're talking about governments in the southern neighborhood, then we know that we are witnessing, the entrenchment of deeper authoritarianism, not least, as I mentioned already, with the case of Al Abd el Fattah in Egypt at the moment, which has exposed not only, the double standards of the EU, but the whole international community, right? So hiding behind, the idea of climate mitigation, we hide what is actually happening on the ground, where all the, international policymakers are sitting, when so many political prisoners are actually behind bars, being tortured and abused. So this would tie interestingly into the EU's humanitarian disguise of why it is doing things like mobility partnerships to make mobility safer, you know, to reduce the smuggling. You know, this is all kind of very well coated in humanitarian discourses, but actually what is happening on the ground is what I call a transactional diplomacy, where we give you money, we promise you this, as long as you hold people back. So I think this can also help you, Stefania, you know, trim the excess in your paper, where quite a lot of the interesting stuff, I think, lies here. So yeah, I think I will stop there because I want to give people time to you know, bring in their own reflections. But I have much more to say, but I want to congratulate you. This is really important work, but I really want to push you because you can go much further with the material you have. So these were just some ideas of where you go with it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think it's already a lot. So Stefania, you can pick and choose to what part in particular you want to reply to. And I know Peter had already a question as well. So I will let you reply and then I'll give the floor to you.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Can
I'm
everybody
sorry,
hear me now?
first Stefania will reply and then I will give you the floor.
Can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. I will give Stefania now the floor to
Alright.
answer the comments and then I will let you know when it's your turn, okay?
All right. I just want to tip in some comments and some discussion on it.
Yes, but I will give you the floor when Stefania has replied to Michelle.
All right. Okay.
Stefania.
Thank you, Michelle, very much for your thorough reading and comments. I think that first of all, I would like to say that I share most of the comments that you have illustrated before, and definitely one of the things that you were claiming is the fact that the European Union is complicit. This is definitely what we would like to stress by identifying this policy tool, which is mobility partnerships, that is often neglected. And we would like to understand why this instrument, this policy tool, is not delivering, despite the commitment of the European Commission on that. The commitment that has emerged from qualitative analysis, and probably Giuseppe would like to add a few comments later on, probably. Well, what is extremely important to say is that the project that we are framed with, within which we are framed, invests on democracy promotion, democratization processes, dictatorships and authoritarian regimes, that in a way, therefore, in a way, we start from these broader research questions that are addressed by the project. And I share with you this fact that I do not feel at ease with this general democracy promotion jargon. But yet we are compelled to address this very, very general issue. We agree with you that we cannot talk about partners without identifying different actors on the side of the partners, and this is an issue that we are dealing with. We do believe that the European Union, with its migration and asylum policy, is of course violating international law in many respects. And what we are assisting, for example, is that these days, if we invest on not allowing irregular migrants to be disembarked on the EU soil or Italian soil, that is the same, we do not respect international law, and we are complicit implementing refoulement. while there is a non-refoulement principle in international law that we should respect. Then it is intriguing to see to what extent EU policies are inconsistent, dealing with regular rather than irregular migration flows. What else? Of course, China has illustrated and in these decades, cooperation, economic cooperation can be more fruitful than human rights standards, a clause that has not been respected by the European Union in the decades. And then, of course, I am in line, absolutely in line with you. Too much complexity. Yes, I agree that there are too many papers within one paper, so many questions, but this kind of events and this seminar is definitely one unique opportunity. We have a privilege to be here commented by you, and this is a way to redefine research questions and hypotheses. Giuseppe, it's 5 and I know that in a couple of minutes you have to go. May I invite you just in case you're still online?
Stefania, I can stay till 5:30. I told my colleagues I can stay till 5:30.
Okay.
So there's no rush.
Okay. Giuseppe, do you have anything to comment and add so far?
Yeah, I also have sorted out my time problem, so I can also stay. Well, first of all, I would like to thank Michelle for her comments, which are very, very helpful, I think. And just to answer one of the points you were mentioning about this Nexus, where does it come from? What we were trying to do was to because while there is it is somehow put forward in this communication and mobility market in the formula more mobility markets and money, there's not an explicit theorization of this nexus. So we tried to reconstruct it through looking at the official documents of like the different communication issued by the Commission during these years, and official speeches and so on. So basically a qualitative document analysis to see how in practice the peoples in Brussels were trying to building this link between mobility and improvement of democracy or democratic governance in a broader sense. So as you were saying, of course, this is the discourse in Brussels, but probably that's for sure that's an aspect we might work on to emphasize this kind of hypocrisies between discourse, intentions, and actions on in the practice of implementing these instruments. So that was just my addition. Thank you.
Okay, so we already have 2 questions. First, Peter, and then Jonathan.
Yeah, I said this topic actually is related to my PhD thesis, which I wrote on the European Union frameworks on external migration and Nigeria immigrants from 2015 to 2020. So the EU external frameworks on migration that my study focused on are Common European Asylum System, Return Directive and Readmission Agreement, AFIC, which is Africa Frontiers Intelligence Community, and the EU Trust Fund for Africa. So these are the external framework that my study focused on. But I'm actually particular about the Return Directive and Readmission Agreement, because the Return Directive and Readmission Agreement is based on the view that the EU agreement on readmission, the EU agreement on readmission, on readmitting the irregular migrant has not been effective, in the sense that most of those, when the EU, when they want to return the irregular migrants, they return them to the hotspot area, that is area where countries where they are still fighting war, country where they are still fighting, where they are passing through insecurity. Like let's take for instance Libya, Tunisia, some of the countries in Africa that are still passing through some difficulty. And when these irregular migrants are in this country, they are also faced with some challenges like detention and the rest like that. So my question now is, how can the EU be able to, how would they be able to reform this readmission and return directive and readmission agreement, whereby they will be able to incorporate African country, whereby African country will be able to agree on this agreement, because we will be able to know that African countries have not been able to focus on this agreement. They've not really has been a major problem. Like let's take for example the 2000 Cotonou Agreement and the 2016 Informal Readmission Agreement provided the necessary condition for the EU to secure commitment and cooperation with some of these neighboring countries, especially the MENA country. But however, they've not been able to cooperate with them. So what can the EU do? What can they do to ensure that these African countries, especially those in the close to Mediterranean Sea, the Libya, Tunisia, Egypt, how can the EU ensure that they are incorporated into this return directive and readmission agreement, and they are able to agree on these formalities? Thank you.
Thank you. Because I know Jonathan has to leave soon, so I will give him the floor for his question, and then Stefania, you can answer to both.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Natalie. And my question in part follows on very nicely from Peter's intervention. So I have 3 quick points for you. So the first is about what we might call, what is the counterfactual? So I saw in your presentation a kind of argument that the focus on mobility actually detracts from the EU's democratization agenda in cooperation with the countries in question. And I guess my first question would be, what is the counterfactual? Is it really, should we really think that if the EU placed less emphasis on migration and mobility, that it would be more effective in democracy promotion? The second is, what are the implications? And here's I come a bit closer to Peter's point of your findings about the ineffectiveness of the mobility partnerships, including on return of illegal migrants, on the EU's current strategy for dealing with migration and asylum. And I think given the ongoing impasses in the EU's own asylum and internal dimensions of asylum and migration policy, it seems that the external dimension, and particularly trying to cooperate with countries who are the source of migration or transit countries, is the only is the main idea that the EU has today. And yet, as we see, it doesn't seem to be very effective. So what conclusions can we draw from that for the internal policy debate within the EU about how to deal with migration and asylum? My final question, I noticed, Stefania and Giuseppe, you didn't say much, or even maybe anything about Libya. And of course, there is no mobility partnership with Libya, but as we know, there is quite a lot of cooperation between the EU and different the rival Libyan regimes, and there have been, terrible revelations about camps in which migrants and refugees are being kept, and where the EU seems to be acquiescing in that. And so, can we say that external cooperation with authoritarian regimes, or even conflict regimes, without a mobility partnership, which is at least in principle negotiated and transparent, can be even worse from a human rights point of view and from the point of view of the EU's values than the mobility partnerships themselves. Thanks.
Stefania, good luck with so many questions.
But I have support from my co-researcher, then I'm on the safe side. Then, Peter, you raised a crucial issue, which is the issue of readmission agreements. And if we look at the reasons why the partners, these three southern neighborhood countries that we have explored, do have problems in getting engaged with the mobility partnership, it is exactly the issue of the readmission agreements relies upon third nationals' repatriation. Then it is the issue of returns of third nationals that does not work, that cannot work, and that the European Union is not able to sort out. Then definitely this is a crucial dimension that the European Union is not officially able to address, but there is no doubt that apart from this specific research and this framework of the southern neighborhood, there is a role that is played by what I call the wider Mediterranean. We cannot consider migration without considering that the Mediterranean is not just made by the southern neighborhood riparian states, what originally were called by the former president of the European Commission a ring of friends. And this was, Michelle was talking about the rhetoric of the European Union. This is a very famous rhetoric of the European Union at the beginning of this century. It's obvious that countries that are transit countries and origin countries have to be taken into account if we want to provide a comprehensive analysis of migration. But actually, the original focus would be Euro-Mediterranean relations, the EU relations with southern countries, specific southern neighborhood countries concerning migration. No doubt that Libya is crucial. Both of you, Jonathan and Peter, you raised the issue of Libya. Of course, the European Union again is complicit in externalizing the control of the EU borders, not only dealing with authoritarian regimes, because if we look at Libya, we do not have an authoritarian regime, we have a failed state. And then if we have failed state, we do make agreements implicitly with several kinds of groups whose democratic appearance is very well known. Of course, democratic is very well known. We all know that smugglers are managing flows. Even today, our news were identifying organized groups that were link Italian criminals with the Tunisian criminals. I mean, smugglers have a role, and we know that they do play a role. No wonder this is not anything new. Then, of course, origin and transit countries are relevant, not just riparian states. What is the counterfactual? Well, the counterfactual comes from our framework, from our research. To what extent the European Union is consistent with its narratives of democracy promotion. Then what comes later, what comes after, is probably more interesting in order to explain why the European Union is investing on, okay, we always talk about externalization. We were talking about externalization dealing with the UTAC agreement, but also the memorandum of understanding with Libya relies upon, for example, cooperation with the Libyan Coast Guard. And what are the Libyan Coast Guard? Soldiers, again, trained in some cases by European or rather Italian soldiers of the Italian Coast Guard. Then for sure we have a problem. We have a problem in terms of our partners, or the partners that we involve in cooperation to deal with migration. But as you were pointing out, of course, perfectly well, Jonathan, it is an issue of what the European Union can achieve. In another research that Giuseppe and I were conducting with Francesca Longo, we were applying to the external dimension of the migration and asylum policy, the concept of organized hypocrisy, and we were trying to prove that when the European Union acts in migration and asylum policy and adopts minimum common standards or minimum common denominator decisions, it is the only position that the EU can take, exactly because either it implodes, either the European Union declares that cannot deliver with migration and asylum policy, or conversely, it decides to adopt minimum common standards. Otherwise, this is an hypocritical behavior. And then, as many other international organizations, the European Union is acting hypocritically because it is the only way how not to declare the EU is over. Then the EU cannot declare the EU is over. Then the EU tends to, or pretends to, invest on policies that are, again, ineffective, which is not much we can say, but even domestically, the European Union is addressing so many democratic issues that we cannot invest on third countries' cooperation dealing with migration and human rights respect, which is another issue that the European Union is unfortunately not taking into account. What else? I don't know if Giuseppe, you want to add anything else?
Yeah, maybe very briefly on the issue of Libya that was mentioned, because we were, when trying to defining the borders of our research, we were thinking of what countries include or not include in this selection. And of course, part of the work has been done keeping in mind the fact that we wanted to focus on mobility partnership as a specific instrument, which was identified, by the way, by the European Union as the instrument for improving mobility. But also the point of Libya is quite relevant, and I thank you for raising it. And not only Libya, but also other agreements the EU is signing, or even not signing, just agreeing at the operational level. And because it raises the issue of informalization, which is quite not new, let's say, but it's becoming more and more important in the way in which the EU manages its external relations. And in a sense, also MPs, mobility partnerships, are less formal tools than readmission agreements, or so even in this kind of soft agreements, which are not binding, which are acts like frameworks for dialogue and the implementation of project in the field, so more in an operational, functional dimension, are already a way of informalizing, in a certain sense, the external migration governance. And in this way, also clearly, Libya, the case of Libya, is the most evident one in which this informalization produced de facto and legitimized de facto practices which are hampering and endangering human rights and so on. But also at the level of, and this is maybe something we could work on, so thank you for raising the point. Also, MPs are in a way informally, an informal or less formal at least, framework for organizing migration governance. And yeah, for sure, this is a relevant point, and a relevant point in particular also in relation to what Michel was saying before, the fact that the EU behaves in practice in a way that betrays its commitments at the level of discourse and rhetoric to democracy, human rights, and rule of law. So yeah, thank you both.
So we still have time for questions. I don't know if anybody has further questions or comments for Stefania and Giuseppe. In waiting for any further comments, I had a question for you, Stefania. It's absolutely not my field, so the foreign relation of the EU. But in the paper, which I read, and I learned a lot of things, you mentioned all the context for that at the beginning of the paper, and I was wondering, to echo Michel's comment also on the fact that the EU does not respect international law, but also internally in the EU we have had challenges of the rule of law. We have had in many countries issues with liberal democracy. To what extent does it also play a role in any claim that the EU could have in supporting democracy or fostering democracy? I mean, in terms of its legitimacy to tell others what to do.
Can we say none, simply?
Sure.
It is a bit more complicated than that, but for sure, the European Union has over time domestically lost its commitments to European values and principles domestically. And we know that migration is one of the issues in which the European Union had for several years a sort of a cleavage. The south, east, but probably it was east versus Germany. Once upon a time there was the Scandinavian bloc. Now the Scandinavian bloc has reshuffled its roles. Well, there are populist trends all over Europe, not only just in Europe, but all over Europe, and therefore the commitment to what was considered for a lot of time as being the inherent added value of European integration probably is not any longer in sight, is not any longer the added value. Is it market? Well, we don't know. Probably in some cases, European Union investments on development and infrastructure has had a clear positive impact on local development, while dying for other for cooperation with the third countries is not an issue, and probably the European Union does not want to die for to help and to deal with irregular migration flows. We already have several domestic issues. Well, for sure, but it is an issue that wakens extremely the third European foreign policy and migration in particular. In the Mediterranean, it is an issue that we are asked to address, for sure, and we do not have the instruments because probably we do not have the political will. Cooperation so far with Tunisia is very much focused in closing the borders, controlling the Tunisian borders. Then this is exactly probably the opposite of what we were thinking about 10 years ago, dealing with cooperation and consolidation of Tunisian democratic political changes.
Thank you very much. Yes, I don't see any hands, so I would like to thank Stefania, Giuseppe, but also Michelle, of course, for the very interesting presentation and all the comments. And I would like to thank the audience as well, also for your patience at the very beginning, but also for the very interesting questions and suggestions for Stefania. And I take this opportunity to invite you all to attend the next seminar, which will take place on the 15th of December, and on a totally different topic on EU employment policy and social citizenship since the Great Recession. Thank you very much to all.
Thank you.
Have a good evening.